Last week, we had a pretty good discussion, I think. Remember, this is week 7 in our series, Spiritual Warfare. Last week, we talked about strongholds and fortresses that we are to pull down. The text that we used was 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 4 through 5. Verse 4, it says that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty. They're mighty for pulling down strongholds. And we talked about what strongholds are. And that's, in essence, what they are fortresses of thought that we construct that keeps us from obeying God's word, that keeps us from doing the things that God has required us to do. Essentially, there are arguments, there are reasons, there are logic that we create that keep us in bondage. In addition to that, we talked about how the enemy is able to inject these thoughts into our minds. And when he does that, oftentimes we receive them as our own thoughts. And we take these thoughts and we cultivate them. And we massage them. And we make them grow into actions. We don't even have a clue that these thoughts that we have, these thoughts that are in our mind, are originated from Satan himself. Remember, we talked about how Satan moved David to number Israel. Remember, we talked about how Ananias and Sapphira, how Satan moved them to keep back part of their money that they had for selling their property. We talked about how Satan was able to enter into Judas's heart to betray Jesus. These thoughts originated from Satan, but these guys that I mentioned, they took these thoughts and they cultivated them and they possessed them as their very own. I believe that if they knew that these thoughts were originated from Satan, chances are they would have rejected them as soon as the thought came into their mind. But they were deceived into thinking that they were their own thoughts. Now, these strongholds, these fortresses that Satan is allowed to construct in our way of thinking, they have a purpose. He's not doing it just to mess with our minds. He has a very specific purpose in doing this. What is that purpose? That purpose is found in our text. Again, it's verse 5 of chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians. And that is casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And this is what we're going to talk about. These strongholds that I just mentioned that we talked about last week, these arguments are designed for a very specific purpose. And as a result, we have an objective as well. We have a very specific assignment that we have to do. And that is to cast down every argument and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Now in this text, we're gonna break this down. We're gonna spend the rest of the day breaking this down and giving you an understanding of exactly what this means, because it means a whole lot. A whole lot. Now, this lofty thing, this high thing that it's talking about here, it's referring to, the Greek word is referring to a sphere that's above the heavens. In essence, what it's saying is that these lofty things, these high things, our thoughts are, we take our thoughts above heaven. We take our thoughts to be more relevant in our lives than God's word. In other words, our thoughts are more relevant than what God's word says. Our logic, our reasoning is more important to us than God's word. We are to follow our thoughts as opposed to what God's word says. Our thoughts are greater than God's thoughts. This is what it's talking about here. These are the lofty things that it's talking about here. All right? We place our thoughts above God's word. And our thoughts are more significant or more relevant to us than what God's word says. And that's, I'd rather follow my own thoughts than obey what God's word says. This is what it's talking about here. All right? Now, again, it exalts themselves against the knowledge of God. What I think is better than what God's word says. This is what it's talking about here. This is our task, if you will. This is our objective. To demolish these thoughts, to demolish these strongholds, to cast them down, to break them down. Now why is this happening? Why do we do this? We do this because God's word oftentimes is contrary to our lifestyle. Right? God's word says this, but our lifestyle is this. And it's contrary. So as a result, we create logic. We create patterns of thought that exalts ourselves above that. In essence, it allows us to continue our sinful lifestyle. It allows us to continue to do the things that we love to do before we came to Christ. You see how it's working now? We want to do this, but God's word says this, and so we create for our own selves, our own reasoning to continue to do this. Right? That's exactly what it's talking about here. And in a roundabout way, what it's saying is that we're just being disobedient. That's what it all boils down to. It all boils down to being disobedient. But keep in mind, this is what Satan is trying to get us to do. When I talk about the strongholds that he creates within our minds, when I talk about the reasoning and the logic that he's able to construct, it's not about us being able to identify something that's major, something that is obvious, rather. It's about the stealth. It's about us being able to identify his deception. And when I talk about his deception, it means that you don't know that it's happening. That's what deception is all about. You don't understand that this is what's happening. And Satan is a master at deception. Like I said before, he's not going to come to us as a horned, red jumpsuited creature. He's going to deceive us into us thinking that he's not even around, that he's not even on the scene. That's his mode of operation. And since we're talking about spiritual warfare, we have to realize this. And keep in mind, this is important because he's trying to get us to exalt ourselves above the knowledge of God. He's never going to try to get me to smoke crack. He knows it's obvious that I'm not a crack smoker. That's the obvious thing. But he will try to get me to exalt my thinking above the knowledge of God. And he's trying to get you to do the same thing. He's not going to try to get you to do the obvious sin that he knows you're not compelled to participate in. He wants to get you to exalt your thinking above the knowledge of God. He knows that chances are, with you guys in particular, that he won't get you to stop hearing God's word. He knows you're going to come to church. He knows that you're going to hear what God's word has to say. He's not going to stop you from doing that. He understands that. But what he's trying to do is to get you to be obedient to it. Hear it all you want to, he says. Come to church all you want to, hear it all you want to, but just don't do it. All right? Be happy, be satisfied, and just hearing what God's word has to say. And that's good enough. Check it off your list, if you will. But that's a deception. That's a lie of the enemy. We're going to talk about that in great detail. Why is it so preposterous for us to think that our thoughts are better than God's thoughts? Our ways are better than his ways. Because essentially that's what we believe, right? We know better than he knows. But that's a deception of the enemy. In Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 through 9, and I have to let you know that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say, you've all heard it before, but it's okay. In Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 through 9, God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God is telling us, my thoughts ain't like your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. My ways and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. So how dare you try to exalt your thoughts above my thoughts? How dare you try to think that your ways are better than my ways? But again, what's happening here? We are exalting our thoughts above God's thoughts. We are exalting our ways above God's ways. And it's preposterous to even think that. To even think, but, for some, that's a reality. That is a reality of life. But see, it's our job as Christians to tear that down, to break down that stronghold. Now, at first glance, on the surface, it may appear as if these individuals are getting away with it, right? It may appear as if nothing's ever going to happen. It may even appear as if they're prospering, right? But that's another lie. That's another deception of the enemy. Because in Job chapter 24, verse 24, it says that only for a little while they are exalted. Now, again, when it says only for a little while, it acknowledges that for that little while they are exalted. It acknowledges that for that little while, it does appear as if they seem to be getting away with it. But it says, and then they're gone. And they are brought low and gathered up like all the others. And they are cut off like heads of grain. So yes, it's true. Only a little while you will be able to get away with it. Only a little while will you be able to exalt your thinking above God's thinking. But then, you're gone. It's just like all the others. Now, oftentimes, there are messages that don't necessarily, at this particular time, fit everybody. But if this message isn't served to speak to you right now, you have to tell people. You have to know this to tell people. You know? Now, again, only for a brief moment will people be allowed to be disobedient to God. Only for a brief moment will people be allowed to exalt themselves above the thoughts in God's word.